You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel. And Daryl's frozen again. All right. Well, looks like the technical problems that we thought we solved, we didn't. That's why I want to apologize to everybody for coming on late. It turns out that first I had a bunch of problems, and then, once I got those fixed, then Daryl started having some technical issues. So I don't know why. It's usually the case, right? I mean, this is what happens sometimes with live shows. And the good news is that at some point, I think during this summer, I'm going to finish the little podcast studio that I'm trying to build in the basement. So that way, once again, Daryl and I can be on site in the same location, which will do a couple of things. Number one, it'll prevent technical glitches like this from happening, as it often does. But the second thing that it'll do is it'll once again put us in the same room. So it'll seem a little bit more cohesive, and it's also going to be, I think, a little bit better too, because the conversation will flow a little freer, because you don't get that delay. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave Daryl's picture up here because it's actually making a nice little thumbnail holder until he can rejoin us. I'm sure he's trying to do it as we speak. And what we're actually going to be talking about today was this thing that's been hitting in the news over the last week now, where Dave Filoni did this interview where he talked about the greatest Jedi of all time. Now, Peter Griffin is joining us, and Peter starts us out right away saying, everyone knows I am the greatest Jedi of all time, besides maybe Daryl and Eric. Well, that may actually be true. I mean, look, everybody that watches this show, we totally appreciate, and we love the fact that you guys support us, and we love the fact that you guys support us through, because look, we're not full-time YouTubers, right? I mean, we would like to be. That's the goal. I mean, if we could get our viewership up enough and we could start bringing in some real revenue into the channel, we would love to do this full-time and then to start producing all kinds of programming. But as it stands right now, that's just not the case. So we do appreciate you guys, watching us, viewing us, and just pretty much supporting the show in the way that you guys have. So thank you for that, Peter. Pretty much, this whole thing stemmed from the interview that Dave Filoni gave recently, where he had, I want to see if I can pull this up. I actually had it up, but my computer was overheating, so I had, I had to shut it down. He gave this interview. He was basically promoting the Ahsoka series that's coming up. And he had this quote in here where, in this whole journey to Ahsoka thing or whatever, he had a quote that started talking about the backstory, where this stuff was falling in this and everything else. And he basically said, we're telling the story of this character who's been trained by the greatest Jedi of all time, Anakin Skywalker. Now, of course, as one could imagine, this pretty much sparked off a whole wave of controversy among Star Wars fans, where you would think that Dave Filoni, being the guy who pretty much, what's the one? There's Daryl. You would think that Dave Filoni, being the guy who pretty much is the most in tune. By the way, Peter Griffin was joining us.
Okay.
You would think that this would be a very interesting statement, right? That he would reveal that Anakin is the greatest Jedi of all time, where he just casually mentions this during this interview. And like I said, it just spawned this entire firestorm of controversy throughout the entire fandom. Now, I mean, I will say that I can understand. I don't agree with this either, by the way, because Lucas himself basically stated that Anakin would have become the greatest Jedi of all time. But unfortunately, when he basically was lost the duel to Obi-Wan, and oh man, Daryl, I think okay, you're back. Yeah, you're kind of freezing and unfreezing, so we'll just
Have a little,
hopefully. Well, my advice
Copper moment.
exactly. My advice would be not to move too much, because the more you move, the more pixels it has to process, and that can. So usually at work, I always tell clients and stuff, it's like, listen, if your Wi-Fi or if something's going wrong with your computer or whatever it is, because like I said, I mean, I was having computer issues too. I mean, between the two of us, it's a miracle we're actually even on tonight. But my advice would be just don't move too much. But it is interesting that, of course, Filoni says this. Now, there's a couple of theories behind why he may have said this. And by the way, I put a poll in the chats that asked, who do you guys think is the greatest Jedi of all time? And I gave the choices of Anakin, Luke Skywalker, and Yoda, or another. Yes, there is another, or whatever. But pretty much, so far, we got one vote. I'm guessing it's Peter, because he's the one that's chatted in so far, that basically said Yoda, the greatest Jedi of all time. And we know from George Lucas that he pretty much said that Anakin could have become the greatest Jedi of all time, but when he lost the battle to Obi-Wan, and he lost a lot of his, because the Force actually flows through living beings, living tissue and stuff. When he lost a lot of that and became mechanical, he pretty much lost the ability to do that. Now, of course, he did become one of the greatest Sith Lords of all time, so there is that. Many would argue that Luke Skywalker, being the grandson of the Force, is the one who probably became the greatest Jedi of all time. And then some people, like, I'm assuming Peter here, basically assume that Yoda was. So where do you stand on all this?
I would say that, yeah, I disagree with Filoni on this simply because, like you said, George, even himself said that Anakin would have been the greatest. But I think you have to just look at, like, it's kind of almost like saying, like, what makes the greatest basketball player of all time? Like, you have to define the parameters of that, because if we're going by like force ability, are we going by legacy? Are we going by how they improve the Jedi Order? I mean, like, how are we gauging this?
Right.
What's the rubric for the greatest Jedi of all time? I mean, if I had to give my honest opinion, I would say I would agree with Peter Griffin and say it's
Yoda?
Yoda. Yeah. And my rationale is simply um it's not, I mean, yes, Anakin had more midichlorians. Now that they brought that into the whole equation, which we all think that was stupid for the most part. But if since it's canon, he had more midichlorians than Yoda. Okay, fine. He had maybe more aptitude
Yeah, or
for the
potential.
Force, or potential. Yeah, you know what I mean? But the thing about Yoda is that the fact that he has longevity, like, he's had more years. Number one, he has a high midichlorian count anyway, just being what his species is. And then on top of that, he has a longevity of his species because he's been able to study the Force a lot longer. He's come in encounter with a lot more things than probably any Jedi will probably have in their lifetime, because who's living to 900 years old, really? So I mean,
Exactly.
unless you find a species that's as old, that can be as old as Yoda or older, with his potential, um, yeah, I'm gonna have to go with Yoda on that one.
Yeah, and I mean, look, well, I was going to say there's no wrong answers. I think Anakin is the wrong answer. But you can make the argument, because there have been people that have thrown out. So in the fandom, people have thrown out Obi-Wan, and I mean, I guess I can understand that. I would almost argue, though, that that's as problematic as saying that Anakin was. Some people have thrown out Qui-Gon. I can understand that, given the films and the limited time that we've seen him. And of course, Qui-Gon was celebrated, right? He was supposed to be one of the best swordsmen of the Jedi Order. He had a lot of
Hmm.
wisdom. He was trained under Dooku, who, of course, was trained under Yoda. He showed a lot of promise and everything like that. And
Hmm.
from that standpoint, maybe, but really, in my mind, I think that you're only really left with a couple of choices here. You either have to go for Yoda or you have to go for Luke.
Yeah.
And I do recognize the fact that Luke Skywalker in current canon, although they have started to fix that a little bit, but in current canon, maybe his his powers or whatever have taken I mean, kind of, not even really. I mean, I know I'm a little all over the place on this, but that's because you basically were left with Luke as a tortured, troubled character who was wallowing in his own failure. That's not how the old expanded universe, what is now Legends, depicted him as. I mean, in fact, you could
Hmm.
almost say that the Legends version of Luke Skywalker was getting to be really overpowered. I mean, they had to actually come up with somebody like the Yuuzhan Vong and stuff like that to even have anybody that can match him, because it was almost a Superman problem. You almost created this guy that's almost godlike that nobody can stand up against. I mean, it was at the point where, if the Emperor was, came back or whatever, Luke could have dispatched him instantly at that point. He became so powerful later on. The current canon version of Luke still has that immense amount of power, but it's tempered a little bit because of course, the emotional roller coaster that he went through, and various
Hmm.
challenges, and of course his failures and things that were weighing on him. And then let's not forget that according to The Last Jedi, he did cut himself off from the Force for a number of years. So there is that too. So yeah, I think that really you're stuck between, well, I don't really want to put it like that. Your choices are, for most powerful Jedi, either Yoda or Luke. Now, of course, look, I know there have been other people along the way. You could bring in some of the High Republic people, probably, if you wanted to. There are other either Legends characters or some new canon characters maybe that have slipped in there. But I think if we're really talking about a real discussion here, then you have to either go for Luke or Yoda on this one.
Yeah. Um. Again, like Luke, of course, being the grandson of the Force, and that's the thing. Like I think a lot of people look at when they say the greatest Jedi. I think they're thinking solely on power, like who
Oh,
has
that's a
the
good point.
you know
Yeah.
I think that's where what trips a lot of people up, but it's not that, and that's why I said on the onset, what's the rubric? Because you have to look at it from this standpoint. At least this is how I do. Okay, you have to look at, okay, this power, but then you also have to look at, like, okay, who's closer to the Jedi objective? Because we can't, because remember, like, Jedi is just not just a title, but it comes with a set of rules. It comes with a lifestyle. So when you look at somebody like Qui-Gon, like, you have to take Qui-Gon off the table simply because he was too much of a rebel.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
true.
okay, that would take, what I'm saying, you have to
Well,
kind of
that's why he was
excuse
kept
him for
off of
that.
the council for that reason. Right? So how could you
Exactly.
say one of the greatest Jedi ever, he wasn't even on the council? I mean, another person that never really seems to come up in this conversation is Mace Windu. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, and Mace, but once again, he's still overshadowed by Yoda, and that's what I'm saying.
he
Like, I
is.
think
He is, yeah.
as powerful as Mace is, you know, he couldn't hold a foot candle to Yoda just simply because Yoda has more time with the Force, and I think that's what makes him the greatest. Because as we've seen through the High Republic, the Jedi Order has changed. It's not like it was just one way the whole time. It's evolved. So even in that, like Yoda has gone through the transitions of the Jedi Order. He's advanced the Jedi Order. He's, probably put more rules or things in place because of his experience, because of things that have happened. And that's why he's like the sage old master, is because even in death, when he's coming back, look, Luke is still like you said, the grandson of the Force. I mean, he's practically almost if we take the Last Jedi, I mean, he's practically godlike almost in that regard. For with the ability to use the Force to project himself across the galaxy. You know what I mean? Like that's I don't think a lot of people take into account the immense amount of power that would take to do
No,
something like that.
I agree. I don't
But
think people have factored that in at all, to be
but the
honest.
thing is, even still at that point, Yoda still had to come back and teach Luke something.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It's because it's
and
like,
again, but here's a question.
Mhm.
Because if you go, okay, who's the greatest Jedi? It's like, where are we stopping? Because yeah, if you just stop at episode 8, well then obviously, okay, Luke is still learning something. But then when you get to episode 9 and beyond, all right, now Luke has learned all this stuff. The bottom line is, no matter if you look at Legends, which happened a lot sooner, a lot quicker, or even if you look at the current canon, the current time period, it's presumed to happen, although the stories haven't technically been written yet, but enough. Luke eclipses Yoda in every scenario, eventually. So there is that you have to factor in. However, looking at a lot of things in totality, because and this goes along to your point, I think, is the fact that Yoda kind of had everything down a lot longer, right? Of course, he had more time. Luke, I think he ends up dying at, I'm not even sure how old he's supposed to be. I think Legends had him dying at around 120 years old. I don't know how old he's supposed to be. I guess if he was 19 around the time of episode 4, right, that puts him at like 20, 21. I think there's like a year between 4 and 5. So maybe like 20. And I think there's like 3 years between that and Return of the Jedi or something. Like 23. And then of course 30 years from that. So I guess he's around his mid 50s to around 60, depending on where you want to put his age at his death. And so you could say that because he did die shortly after that, okay, yeah, Yoda obviously had hundreds and hundreds of years on him. Because everybody forgets, Yoda was one of the key characters of the High Republic, too. Now, so far,
right,
the only thing that we have, other than the books, it's that Young Jedi series or something that was released in May. When they released Visions, which, by the way, if you guys missed it, we reviewed all 9 episodes of Visions, and that's up on our channel right now. You can just look at our Visions playlist or whatever. You can actually catch up on our Season 1 reviews and our Season 2. But around that time, they released the Young Jedi Adventures or something. I don't remember exactly what it was called. It was one of those things that it didn't really interest me because it was clearly aimed towards kids. And, I mean, it might be something I check out on curiosity, especially because I was reminded of this fact. Because apparently, while Ahsoka is coming out on August 23rd, on August, I want to say it's like 4th or something, they're actually releasing the second half of this Young Jedi Adventure series or whatever that they had originally done on May 4th. So it's going to be fascinating to see where that goes because, and this is the only thing that would get me to watch this, by the way, is the fact that it is the first series of any kind, live action, animation, whatever, movie, that actually takes place during the High Republic period. Finally depicted in some form of, non-book form.
Visual medium.
Yeah, visual medium. There you go.
Okay.
So for that reason alone, it would almost be worth checking out. But until we get something a little bit more substantial, maybe that delves into the High Republic era. I mean, we know that the Acolyte is supposed to cover like the tail end of it or something. But
Mm-hmm.
even if you read some of the books, and again, I've gotten a little bit behind on them. You know, I've read like two and a half of them, and there's probably like 6 now of actual full blown novels. It could even be more. That really is a time period where Yoda was a little bit more at his zenith, and you could tell even just in that period or whatever that okay, yeah, this guy is like formidable. I mean, there's no way that Anakin at his most powerful couldn't beat him. Now, the Emperor did say during the duel in Revenge of the Sith, like, listen, Anakin's going to be more powerful than both of us eventually. I mean, it's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
done deal. The guy, I mean, even Palpatine knew, like, look, you and I are sitting here battling it out, and this guy is going to be more powerful than either one of us, maybe both of us combined. So even Palpatine saw this. That's why he wanted him on his side. So
Mm-hmm.
again, I think I need to just stress this. The potential for Anakin to be the greatest Jedi ever was there. But in actuality, he wasn't. Now, of course, he did become like probably the second most powerful Sith Lord. So, you know, consolation prize. But I wanted to see what you thought of this. A lot of people were thinking that this was a statement because of Ahsoka being trained by him. She was trained by the greatest Jedi ever. I think that with some more apologist leaning people where Filoni is concerned, we're leaning towards this. We're saying that look, what Filoni was talking about was in the context of when this comment was supposedly made, right? So at the time that he's training Ahsoka, even though obviously he hadn't achieved that yet, he's well on his way because everybody knows he's the chosen one. So what were your thoughts on that? Or do you think that's like a cheap cop out?
Yeah, I still think that's a cheap cop out just
Fair
because,
enough.
you know, at the time, like I said, he's still like, okay, by Revenge of the Sith, he's pretty powerful,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But the thing is, and it's still even it's still proven in the Obi-Wan series that like, you know, his his mentality is not what it should be. I mean, like that's what I'm saying. Like when we're talking about power, yes, I would say Anakin probably. If we were talking, if this conversation was geared towards who's the most powerful Jedi, I can hang with you because, I mean, the guy is conceived of the Force. What more power? You know, what I'm saying, like even Yoda, like I said, or like you just said a moment ago, like Palpatine said it, like he's gonna be more powerful than the both of us. But that doesn't make you the greatest, though.
Well, I think
And
that's where
that's
everybody is getting hung up,
and that's
right?
and
Because
that's what I'm saying. That's where everybody's getting hung up because it's kind of like how a lot of people might debate um basketball, and I use this often as an analogy, and some people probably try to have my head for this, but here it goes. People arguably will say like, "Oh, Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player ever." I think that's subjective. I think he's the greatest scorer of all time. But like LeBron James, I mean, he could do everything that Michael Jordan could do, but he's taller, he's bigger, and he can play every position on the court. So to me, that would make LeBron James probably the greatest basketball player because he can do everything extremely well at different levels on different positions. Whereas Michael Jordan was kind of like a single focus. With
right.
Anakin, it's the same thing. And looking at Anakin, it's the same thing as far as powerful. And that's all he was really concerned about. He kept saying, like, oh, um, I want to be, like he was always in search of power, not in search of knowledge, how to be a better Jedi, he was looking to be the more powerful one because he was always heard he was the chosen one. And that's why Obi-Wan was able to best him even in the Obi-Wan series when he duped him with that whole they kept doing those flashbacks
Mm-hmm.
when they were basically sparring with lightsabers and how he deceived Anakin because Anakin is always looking for the quickest way. He's always looking for the quickest way to victory and that was ultimately his downfall. So that's why it doesn't make him the greatest Jedi. Like, if you want to start putting people in I will replace Anakin with Obi-Wan in that case. I would say
Well, and
Obi-Wan,
people,
Luke.
yes, people have made
Yeah,
that
and that's
point
what I say.
actually.
Obi-Wan, Luke, and Yoda are probably the top 3 greatest Jedi of all time. Simply
Yeah,
because of what the Jedi, and especially because of what the Jedi code stands for. And
right.
that's the other thing that people have to keep in mind is like it's not just about your force ability or your fighting style. It's it's deeper than that. It's more like, okay, do you really understand what being a Jedi actually means? Can you be selfless? Can you like we watched Obi-Wan, like even though he was in love with Duchess Satine, he still had to like and even Anakin was like, dude, I know you're in love with her. Why didn't you save her? I can't. It's about the greater good. It's not about me. See, that's what
Mhm.
being a Jedi is about. And Anakin couldn't understand it. He couldn't see past his own ambition. And that was his ultimate downfall. Now, that's why I say, well, if we're looking at things like that, you know, Luke really didn't have that problem. I mean, he kind of did. He said, I thought I could train him, you know, just as good as, you know, Yoda or Obi-Wan. Even Obi-Wan had that thing. He's like, I thought I could train him just as well as Master Yoda. I was wrong. You know what I mean? It's that arrogance that time at times. And so you really have to keep that in check. And that's the hard part. You know you're good. You kind of start to just like, I can handle it. It doesn't matter because I'm powerful. But Yoda understood the fact that it's like, okay, yes, I know I'm powerful, but I'm still not going to underestimate the powers of the Emperor. I'm still not going to just, he gave that warning to Luke, like, don't underestimate him. Don't think you can just walk in there like, oh, I am a Jedi. Like, oh, okay, that's
Yeah.
not the be all
Yeah.
end all,
No.
buddy.
Well, and again,
And
there's just so much there. I mean, even going back to the LeBron James versus Michael Jordan thing, I think a lot of that, and this happens, I think, even in, well, really in anything. Right now, we're talking about Star Wars, but
Mhm,
it's what came first. Now, of course, I guess if you're going to adhere strictly to that, then you would actually lean towards Yoda in that case. But I think that in the basketball thing, I think with Michael Jordan, it's because of the fact that he was there first. He did a lot of the stuff first. I look at a lot of,
mhm,
I look a lot, and again, people would probably even pick it apart further than what we're doing. But
mhm,
you can even say the same thing about the boxing world, right? Muhammad Ali,
mhm.
considered the
Yep.
greatest. Now, there have been people
Mhm,
that have come along that could technically beat some of his stats, but there are
mhm.
certain elements that he possessed. Schwarzenegger, the same thing. There are a lot
Yep.
of people that came along that were bigger than him, but the symmetry that he had, just a lot of the things that he overcame. It's like these people that came after, and this is where I think the LeBron James thing fits too, is the fact
Yep.
that once the road is paved, it's easier to travel on it. And this
Sure.
is something that I think people forget is that when it's a gravelly dirt road and you have to build that road, even though people could come along later that maybe technically have improved stats compared to you, it's the fact that you were that first guy that traversed it and did it
Mhm.
and built the road. And now it's pretty much these other guys are building their careers on your shoulders. That's the reason why they give the credit to these
Yeah.
guys, even though technically, like in saying the case of LeBron James, okay, yeah, he could play the game better, but he's still kind of standing on the shoulders of Jordan in that sense. Same
Yeah,
thing with,
absolutely.
like, because I mean, technically, if you think about it, Mike Tyson was probably better than Muhammad Ali, statistically speaking, in every way, but
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of challenges that Ali faced that Tyson didn't have to, because it was Ali that paved the way. And
Sure,
you
absolutely.
you can look at that even with the Yoda Anakin thing. Now, of course, in that way we're kind of flipping it around, because Yoda did actually come first, right? So I think where people get tripped up, and again, I agree with you. I actually think, and I'm going to just say this because I think that you pretty much at the top of this show hit the nail on the head, which is you got to look at, you call it rubrics, of course, it's like a educational kind of a thing. You
Mm-hmm.
you can call it parameters, you can, whatever, the
Scope, yeah,
criteria, the
yeah, the
scope. I
criteria,
mean, there's all kinds of different words that you can use, but the point is you have to frame this in such
yeah,
a way
yeah,
that, because like you said, they didn't say most powerful, they didn't say most agile, they didn't say best lightsaber duelist. Basically, Filoni said greatest. Well, what
mm-hmm.
constitute the greatest? Because really, like you said, that's kind of a vague term, actually. It's, I mean,
Yeah,
greatest at what?
because
Are you talking about overall? Are you talking about one thing?
yeah, I mean, you also have to look at, and this is whenever you hold conversations about the greatest anything, whether you're talking about, you know, the greatest guitar player, you're talking about the greatest bassist, the greatest football player, the greatest basketball, the greatest Jedi, the greatest Sith. You always have to you have to set the parameters for it all. And one of the parameters that I think that a lot of people kind of fail to highlight, which is a very important thing, is impact,
Well,
right?
yeah, that too, right?
Because like Yoda revolutionized like pretty much the Jedi Order. He refashioned, like I said, the Jedi Order by the time it came in his hands had changed. I don't want to say styles, but the operations of how the Jedi moved. And he was the forefront. He was the leader of all that for years. Not like 10, 20. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years. You know, he even said hundreds of years have I trained Jedi, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
what can you
right.
tell me about
Yeah.
this? You know what I mean?
What
Like
do
there's
you know of Ready? Exactly. It's kind of
exactly.
like,
It's like
who are
what
you, dude?
exactly. And it's just it's one of those things, but it's the impact. It's like, okay, Master Yoda was revered everywhere. Like
Well, and for
he
good
was pretty
reason.
much, and for good reason, yeah. But at the same time, it's just like and he was always everyone's measuring stick. That's what I'm saying. It's like that's his impact. It's not even he's like, oh, you practice your saber skills as you did your wit. You could rival Master Yoda as a swordsman. Just stuff like he's always you can't figure out stuff, who does everyone go to? Yoda. Like because he's the Google of the Jedi. Like you have a Jedi archive in a library, but I mean, for most things, you could go to Yoda for, and he can pretty
Well,
much
just jumping
direct it
on
or
that,
figure it
right?
out.
Jocasta basically was just kind of like, oh, well, if it's not in the archives, it doesn't exist. Well, who was it that actually
Mhm.
figured it out? It was Yoda. I mean, the kid kind
Right.
of had
The
something,
youngling.
but
Yeah.
I mean, still, Yoda was the one that basically had the wisdom to know, like, hey, listen, just because the Jedi archive doesn't have it doesn't really mean much.
Doesn't mean it.
Whereas
Yeah. It
you
just
get
means that
somebody like Jocasta Nu. Now,
anything could have
again, she
happened.
she went up against Vader and actually did fairly well in a lightsaber duel. That was a very, very strange comic issue. But you know what? It put her in a new light, though. Like, you understood, oh yeah, this chick is formidable. She's knowledgeable. She's up there too. She's wise. But Yoda was always just a little bit wiser than even the wisest Jedi. And like you said, yeah, I mean, you made a great point. I mean, he's the guy that established the template for all this stuff. Not
Mhm.
only was he the leader of the Jedi Council for a long time, but he's the guy that also sort of recreated it. Like,
Yeah.
hey, you know what? It used to be this. Well, now this is what we're doing. I'm creating this new template for what the Jedi Order is going to be from now on. And then he leads it. And then he, all these people that he had to go up against and fight. And, this is a really experienced guy. And another thing that you can't overlook, too, is that as powerful as Anakin was, if it had been Yoda that had gone to meet him on Mustafar, I mean, the battle would have been over in like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yoda would have just decimated him within seconds. It wouldn't have even been a fight. In fact, I remember that was one of the things, and I said this during the review of Revenge of the Sith, and we've talked about this in various shows and conversations that we've had, is that what they should have done was Yoda should have just gone with Obi-Wan to Mustafar, dealt with Anakin, and then together gone. I mean, we all know that Palpatine would have dispatched with Obi-Wan probably in 2 minutes, and it still would have been Yoda versus the Emperor, but...
because you saw what Dooku did to him early in the movie, like
twice Dooku did it,
exactly.
Right? So I mean,
right. At least Anakin got his lick back.
I mean, Obi-Wan usually is taken out. Okay, he goes up against him, but he could be like cannon fodder, so Yoda could rest for a second or whatever. It's you go in there and get vanquished within like 30 seconds. But the point is, if they had done it each step together, they might have had more of a fighting chance. And they didn't do that, and instead, I think that was also Yoda's way of maybe advancing Yoda or Obi-Wan's training a little bit, like you having to go against this guy that you come to feel is a brother, right? It's like you have to now. It's almost like the next evolution in your Jedi training, in a sense. But
absolutely, because he had to do it. Because you think about it, in Episode 2, he had to fight his old Padawan.
Yeah, right. And I guess
Yoda did it. Yoda did it with no problem. He was just like,
nope.
All right.
Yep.
He opened that cloak up and
like, listen,
let's have at it.
I'm gonna give you one shot. We could be cool about this, but if this is where you want to go, this is where we're gonna go. But that said, again, when you have the whole fate of the galaxy here, and we've said this even as commentaries, both when we did our recent reviews, which again, if you guys missed that, we did review all 9 of the movies, actually. Well, more than that, because of Rogue One and Solo. So all like 11 of the films. When our What Is Star Wars series. If you guys want to go back and check that out, it's top-notch entertainment, I promise you. But we have said over numerous shows, in those reviews, just anytime we reference them, that when there's the fate of the galaxy at stake, maybe they could have planned this a little better. It's like maybe, I don't know. Because if you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, well, if, Luke fails or whatever, there's another. We of course learned the other was Leia. It's like, well, then don't you think maybe you should have just been, I don't know, training her in the background and just
right, that way she's ready to go.
Because I mean, if Luke gets vanquished or whatever, what are you gonna wait another 10 years? I mean, I don't. Like, there just didn't seem to be a plan to me.
Yeah, especially like, Leia could have got popped being on one of those ships or something. Now she's dead. Now what?
Exactly. It's like, you guys just didn't really think this one through. That's all I'm saying. It's just, there's things that they probably could have and should have done that would have been a little bit more effective, but they didn't. So those are the kinds of things that I think that, yes, when you look at things in totality, it's surprising that Filoni did actually go through and say, yeah, Anakin's the greatest Jedi. Now, again, being that it's Filoni, and we're trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, because this is the guy that even the two of us, have said, he's like, he's studied under the creator. He's the heir apparent, right? He's the guy that actually, other than Lucas, really understands all this stuff. And knowing the deep understanding that Filoni has, you do take a little bit of a pause. You don't just... It's not like Kathleen Kennedy said this, in other words. Where you would just shred this thing and go, you're an idiot and move on. It's like, okay, well, Filoni's saying this, so now we're all trying to... I mean, I guess after you have the initial reaction of, that's insane, and, here's all the people that actually should be considered the greatest Jedi, you do have to take pause and say, well, what was Filoni really talking about? Where was he coming from? Because he would not make a
Yeah,
statement like this carelessly. I don't think anymore.
right. No, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, and I wish we could. I mean, of course, we like could sit down with him and talk to him about anything Star Wars, quite frankly.
Yeah, wouldn't that
But
be
I would
great? Yeah,
really,
I got an interview
I know.
scheduled with him for Monday's show. We'll just ask him, then.
But I think that would be just to sit down and pick his brain and just ask him, like, okay, what did you mean by this? And man, and I get it, like maybe he meant to say like one of the greatest, of all time, which I could see that. Like if you want to include him in the annals of the greats of Yoda, Mace, Anakin, I mean Obi-Wan and Luke, you could put Anakin in there if for even for the time that by that time he became really truly great.
Sure, look
Um
at the Clone Wars series.
yeah, exactly.
They would have been toast without him.
Mhm. So, but to say he's the ultimate, the be all end all greatest Jedi of all time, I unless I would have to hear Dave Filoni's explanation. I mean, before I would change my before I would be willing to change my mind.
Well, and you also bring up another point too that I think that people sometimes overlook. He could have just I mean, we're so used to micro managing our expectations of anything Star Wars related to the point that when these guys say anything, we're putting it through a microscope, analyzing it to death. I mean, when you really stop and think about these poor people who have to just give these interviews or whatever, and they're considered an authority on this, that every word that these people utter, especially somebody like Filoni, they're just under this scrutiny that just the average person wouldn't. I mean, I've often talked about this, and I do plan to do this at some point, where you and I actually go back and look at some of our older interviews, and say, well, what would have happened if if we watch it maybe a few months later? We might think, oh, well, guess what? It looks like, you know, this thing that we said 2 months ago in a video, we probably just carelessly said it in a conversation, and maybe we would have said it a little differently. So in other words, these people are putting the words of a person like Filoni or even Favreau or any of these guys under this intense scrutiny, this crazy microscope. And I think that you do have to, where he goes, oh yeah, he was trained by one of the greatest Jedi or the greatest Jedi of all time. It's like, well, he might have just been talking about the context of that moment. There's all kinds of things he might have been talking about, and it's like, here is the entire fandom putting this now under this microscope and going, no, it's really Obi-Wan or Yoda or, I don't know, Ahsoka or Luke or whoever, I mean, it is true that it would almost be interesting to see if Filoni ends up doing a follow-up statement because of, again, it's funny that you and I decided. So I think this story came out like maybe, oh boy, I want to say, like earlier in the week or something. Because I think that what happened was we were doing our Monday Visions review or something, and I think you ran across the story that day and said, hey,
Yes,
maybe we should
it was
talk
part of
about
the
this.
whole. If you guys go on YouTube, you guys can see the video where he says it.
Yeah, it's a Journey to
The Journey to
Ahsoka thing,
Ahsoka.
right? Yeah.
Mhm.
And, it might have just been some off-the-cuff remark or something like that. And all of fandom is jumping on it. I mean, it's funny because at the time that you and I were talking about doing the show, it was just something that he said. But in the interim, between the time Monday where you said, hey, this might be a good thing to talk about for Friday's show, and then in the days leading up to this show, it's amazing how everybody has just jumped on this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, again, they're putting it through this intense scrutiny, and there's all the usual criticism, and I mean, there's just like all kinds of things right now going on behind the scenes of Lucasfilm, right? Because there's been rumors that Favreau is now out, that pretty much there's he's kind of a victim of the civil war at Disney. You have the Kathleen Kennedy versus Iger versus everything else. Now, of course, there's been a lot of statements from Favreau himself that's just basically like, no, we haven't gotten any studio interference, because they thought that with the season 3 of The Mandalorian, to have Din and Grogu reunite, they thought that maybe that was a studio interference thing, but that was something that Favreau had planned for a long time. Some of the stuff like the Lizzo Jack Black thing, I mean, there's a lot of things that it turns out that Favreau was like, no, we're just basically seeing where the story takes us. We do have a little bit of an outline going, but for the most part, we're just going to see where the story takes us, and, we change our minds periodically. But then there's the other side where people have looked at where the Book of Boba Fett went, season 3 of The Mandalorian maybe not living up to seasons 1 and 2, and they're imagining that, now Favreau's out. So there's just all kinds of things going on behind the scenes, and I think maybe this is adding to it.
Yeah. So to wrap this up, who's your ultimate pick?
I'd still say Luke. I mean, I get the whole Yoda thing, but Luke, he's eventually, whether you go by the legend stories or even further down in the canonical stories, Luke eventually surpasses Yoda in every way. He eclipses him in power, he eclipses him in knowledge, he eclipses him in basically understanding. He just eventually, and that's the way that it should be, because Luke is the grandson of the Force. He is, the way that they implied it was the prequel trilogy set up Anakin as the chosen one, but then Luke sort of took on that mantle when Anakin fell to the dark side. Now, of course, there are people out there that have said that Rey ended up being the new chosen one, and basically what ends up happening is, like, in every generation, the Force chooses somebody. So it's not like there's one chosen one. It comes to that whole darkness rises, light, comes up to meet it. So there's a new chosen one in the Force or whatever. But if you really just want to go by the strict prophecy of everything, then yeah, Luke essentially succeeds where his father failed, right? His father fell to the dark, like he had all this potential, and then he fell to the dark side. Well, Luke ended up picking that up and then fulfilling that destiny. He did bring balance to the Force. He did destroy the Emperor. He did redeem his father. That's another thing you got to look at, too, when you look at Luke versus Yoda, is that Luke actually succeeded where Yoda failed. Luke is the one that brought Vader back to the light side. I mean, granted, he had kind of a leg up on it, right, because he was a kid and just kind of tugging on the old Sith heartstrings there, but he also is the one that, through that redemption, defeated the Emperor. And then if you go by legends, he defeated the Emperor's clone. If you don't go by legends and you just want to stick with canon, you could say, well, he trained Rey, and Rey defeated the Emperor. So, I mean, by proxy even, Luke, he pretty much succeeded where Yoda failed. But that was by design.
That's very valid. Yeah.
Because Yoda designed it that way, right? I mean, Yoda failed, and then he said, okay, you watch over Luke, and then we'll put Leia with Bail, and we'll, she'll be the backup plan, basically, and, we'll train Luke. And so you can almost say the same thing, is that, Yoda, through Luke's successes, swung things the other way. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways, really, you could look at this whole thing if you really want to, if you're insane like we are, and really want to go deep into this and analyze and don't just shut this off and go, okay, guys, it's just a movie. Y'all are really, reading a little bit too much into this. But if you actually do want to go into a lot of the things that we go into, which is why we have this show, then yeah, you can you can look at it from all these different angles, and that's where it becomes interesting. That's the reason why you said this would be a great topic for us to discuss tonight, because it's more than just what I think, and this is what I think separates our show from other shows. Other shows are more or less going into the surface of it. I don't want to say every show, because there are a lot of like philosophical based shows and things that go like really deep into the lore, some even deeper than us. But I would say that one thing that separates us is we really look at this from sort of a macrocosm, right? Kind of like a big picture. We do delve into the details a little bit, but more so in order to inform the big picture rather than just for the sake of getting into the details. And that's where I think this is really great. It really allows you to look at this from different angles. But I think that one thing you can get no matter what is that Anakin is not the greatest Jedi. It's almost like The Biggest Loser. At the end of The Biggest Loser, they're like, I'm sorry, you are not the biggest loser.
Right.
Goodbye, Andy. That kind of thing. Well, it's sort of the same thing, right? I'm sorry, you are not the greatest Jedi. We'll have to say goodbye now, Anakin. It's kind of the same deal. Allison Sweeney giving the speech. All right, but again, as always, it's not about necessarily. Well, I mean, at least for the first hour, it's about what we think. But afterwards, wherever there's some discussion, I actually thought there would be more chatting tonight. I'm really kind of surprised that there wasn't more chatting tonight. But you know what? That's fine. Look, it's summer. It's Friday night. I mean, it's not exactly a mystery. I mean, there's probably people out, enjoying the weather and doing whatever. So it's cool. Usually our Friday shows do a lot better in the wintertime when everybody's shut up and, there's nothing else to do. But for those of you guys who are watching us live, you do still have about another 20 to 30 seconds to chat in whatever it is you want. For everybody else, if you're watching on the rebroadcast, definitely leave in the comment section. We had a poll up for this whole thing, which basically was, well, who do you think the greatest Jedi is? Is it Anakin? Is it Luke? Is it Yoda? I mean, we could throw Obi-Wan in there, Qui-Gon, whoever. Or is it somebody else? Some weird character from some comic series that, I'd forgotten about or whatever. I mean, you guys, look, you might even say it was Dooku. Look, there's a big argument for people to say that Dooku got it, and that's why he was attempting to do the whole, like, balancing the light and the dark thing, but of course he more or less failed at that. But, look, we'll entertain all and every opinion on this, so just leave it in the comment section and let us know, who do you think was the greatest Jedi? Because Filoni seems to be under the impression that it's Anakin. So hopefully we'll get some clarification on that. So I don't know, you have anything else you want to say in closing?
No, I'm just saying, just stay tuned for Monday. We got another good one. We're going to be talking about the Ahsoka trailer. So that's coming up.
Yes.
And our reactions and our concerns with that. So can't wait to see you guys on Monday.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Monday, we're going to be reacting to the Ahsoka trailer that came out earlier this week. That's another big thing. We got our first real look at Thrawn. But again, there were some things in that trailer that did give us a few concerns, and Daryl and I would like to address that with you guys on Monday. So check us out Monday night at 8 o'clock. So until then, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.